And we're now going to turn our attention to a topic that we heard about in this last session, the opioid crisis, which is one of, if not the most pressing public health issues that we're facing right now in the country. To quote just one statistic from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, in the U.S. in 2016, every day, on the average day, 116 people died from an opioid-related drug overdose. So here to talk about the epidemic are Anna Lembke and Ann Case, and this session will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Mark Cullen. Mark is a senior fellow at SIEPR and the senior associate dean for research at the Stanford School of Medicine. He's also the director of the Center for Population Health Sciences here at Stanford. The center focuses on the widening health disparities between rich and poor, whites and non-whites, and between women and men. And I quite honestly could not think of a better moderator on the planet for this panel. So with that, let me turn things over to Professor Mark Cullen.
I'm going to have them come join me on the stage here. Why don't you come up and join me? Good afternoon, everybody. You are, as always, an august and impressive crowd. It's been probably about a decade since where I sit in the public health research community, the first anecdotes, rumors, reports of something dreadful occurring in our society began to emerge. But like many of my colleagues, I didn't entirely see the handwriting on the wall. There were several reasons for it. Many of you will recall that 8 or 9 years ago, we were in the midst of a very conspicuous national debate about healthcare and about access, which had some effect of dwarfing much of what was going on. And we were also at that time in the midst of a dreadful recession. And this created both a context for many of the things perhaps that have now been better observed, but also a context in which many of us as observers of health, especially health disparities, were to some extent not really given the best opportunity to really see these data in their full context. And finally, I just want to point out, again, for context setting, that for those of us who do study disparities, racial, ethnic disparities, geographic disparities, and sex disparities by health, early looks at some of the data that were coming out from demographers and others over the past decade actually were by many of us misconstrued, which is to say, rather than seeing what we now will clearly see and hear about in the next few minutes, many of us saw actually quite the reverse, much like an Escher painting in which you can either see the birds flying into the ocean or you can see the fish trying to fly. What we saw was remarkable and unprecedented, and as of yet still not entirely well explained, improvements in the mortality experience of our ethnic minorities, in particular African American men. Of course, we should have looked closely at the signs, and I say that quite literally, because as we began to look closely at the signs, the true picture of what was going on began to emerge. And it's in that context that I have the great pleasure of introducing today two women who did not miss the signs and who've contributed enormously to both the public awareness and recognition of the scope of the crisis that we now face. It's my pleasure first to introduce my colleague, Anna Lembke from the School of Medicine. Anna, a Summa Yale graduate, came west to medical school. We were lucky to keep her here. She subsequently, after training in psychiatry and in addiction medicine, joined our faculty in 2010, where she has been a rising star. Her book in 2016, Drug Dealer MD, I think is one of the hallmark events that has brought the kind of attention to this problem that brings us all here today. Anyway, Anna.
Gosh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm honored and excited to be here today. I've been sitting in the room all morning long, and it's so inspired by all these wonderful speakers. I'm going to be talking about a little bit less inspiring topic. My job in about 12 to 15 minutes is to sort of give a historical context for how we got here today. And then I want to describe to you the reasons why I think we haven't made more progress to date. And finally, very briefly, things I think we might do that we aren't doing well enough to try to combat the problem. And ultimately, my hypothesis is that the current opioid epidemic is, in fact, a symptom of our faltering healthcare system. I have no conflicts except for my internal psychological ones, which I will, in fact, be sharing with you to some extent. Okay. Prior to 1980, doctors were very reluctant to prescribe opioids because they were worried that their patients would get addicted. But there was recognition in the 1980s that we weren't doing enough to treat pain. And so there was this idea that perhaps we should use opioids more liberally, especially at the end of life, especially at people with seriously debilitating pain. And that was a good idea. The problem was that by the end of the late 1990s, doctors were dispensing opioids like vending machines to pretty much anybody who walked into the offices and said, I have pain. And today we are facing the worst drug crisis in US history. This is a graph just showing how as opioid sales went up, opioid deaths and opioid treatment admissions also increased. I think it's important to understand that people who are dying from prescription opioids in particular are people who have become addicted to them through a doctor's prescription and so are taking more and more until they are overdosing accidentally. But they're also people who are taking opioids just as prescribed by their doctor because the tolerance to the pain-relieving effects of opioids happens very quickly, but not necessarily the tolerance to the respiratory suppressant effects. So what happens is people go to higher and higher doses to target their pain, prescribed by their doctor, prescribed by a single well-intentioned doctor, and their breathing goes down and their heart rate goes down and they fall asleep and never wake up. People who are dying from prescription opioids are also teens who find a single bolus of OxyContin, 160 milligrams, in their grandparents' medicine cabinet, take it once at a party with friends, and die because of that single event. This is a photograph that was taken in Ohio. These individuals in the front seat are unconscious, not deceased, because of opioids. I like to show this picture to emphasize the multi-generational trauma wrought by this epidemic. You'll note the watchful waiting of the child in the background. I also show this picture to emphasize that people who become addicted to opioids are people who drive minivans. They're people who strap their kids into their car seats. They're people just like you and me. It's also important to recognize that although we pay a lot of attention to opioid-related deaths as a metric of this crisis, it is not the only measurement of the crisis. There are more than 11 million people in this country who are misusing/addicted to prescription opioids. I showed this picture from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health to emphasize that that big yellow circle is the 11+ million people misusing prescription opioids. That little orange circle is the 300+ people using heroin. So there's a lot of attention now, as there should be, on illicit sources like heroin and illicit fentanyl, but prescription opioid misuse is still an enormous problem in this country today. This is from that same survey showing where people get the opioids that they are misusing, and I want you to pay attention to the fact that that blue area on the right is people who get their opioids from a single prescriber. So we still have a very serious problem of overprescribing. The largest portion there is people who get their opioids from a friend or a family member who often got it from a single prescriber. So whether directly or indirectly, the majority of misused prescription opioids in this country come through a doctor's prescription. So where are we now? There's been a lot of effort at the local, national, and federal level to try to combat the opioid epidemic, but sad to say, we haven't made much progress. It's hard to know if our strategies are not effective or if it's just a very slow turning ship or some combination. But you can see now we're in the second wave of this epidemic. People have now turned to illicit sources, heroin, illicit fentanyl. I think it's important to emphasize, though, looking at this graph, that people dying from prescription opioids has gone down a little bit, but not appreciably. And the majority, in fact, 3/4 or more of people turning to illicit sources of opioids started with a prescription opioid through a doctor's prescription. We are still prescribing way too much. So although opioid prescribing in this country has decreased approximately 15% since its peak in about 2012, we are still prescribing the majority of the world's opioids, about 40%, despite constituting less than 5% of the world's population. We still prescribe way more than other developed countries with aging populations. We prescribe more opioids, 4 times as many as Europe, more than 10 times as many as Japan. And there's also the hidden epidemic of benzodiazepines. We just published this article a couple of weeks ago in the New England Journal showing that benzodiazepine, that Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan, Valium, also causes death, that rates of benzodiazepine prescribing is going up, and consumption and related deaths, and that when you combine opioids with benzodiazepines, the risk of accidental death is 4-fold. If I have not convinced you so far already that we have this very serious problem of opioid overprescribing and overconsumption that is ongoing, I want to share with you a case that came by my desk late last year, a colleague who contacted me because she was very concerned of this young man, 28-year-old male, with chronic pain from the tips of his eyelashes to the tips of his toes, being prescribed the following regimen by a single prescriber. 40 milligrams of Opana twice a day, that's an opioid. 30 milligrams of Dilaudid once a day, that's an opioid. 60 milligrams of oxycodone once a day, that's an opioid. 20 milligrams of Valium, that's a benzodiazepine. 60 milligrams of phenobarbital, a potent sedative. 30 milligrams of temazepam once a day, that's benzodiazepine, and 8 milligrams of Xanax once a day. These are the kinds of cases that we have seen. These are the kinds of cases that we are still seeing. This individual with, by the way, no verifiable organic pathology is being prescribed by a single well-intentioned family care doctor the equivalent of 470 morphine milligram equivalents daily, which, by the way, the average heroin-addicted individual takes 100 morphine milligram equivalents daily. I asked my colleague, can you tell me something about this family medicine doctor? He said, she's a really nice doctor, really good person, inherited this patient from another family medicine doctor who retired. So I do think because this problem is ongoing, we need to take a deeper look. What are we missing here? Again, I would say to you that the opioid epidemic is the canary in the coal mine, that in fact opioids have become the solution, not to patients' problems, but to doctors' problems. And what are those problems? Importantly, this is an epidemic, first and foremost, of overprescribing, and not just pill mill doctors, not just doctors who have lost their moral compass. These are well-intentioned, compassionate doctors who went into medicine to do the right thing, who are caught in a system gone mad. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. What motivates the compassionate doctor? Mutually affectionate relationships. So that's one thing right there. You've got a whole cohort of individuals who went into the business of medicine to heal suffering, to save lives. They never would imagine that their patients are manipulating them or second-guessing them, and they're not trained how to handle that. They want to preserve this mutually affectionate relationship, and they don't have the skills to interrogate patients around whether or not they're misusing their drugs. What motivates the drug-seeking patient? These molecules are highly inherently addictive. They cause brain changes such that that individual is walking around in dopamine deficit with an intense physiologic need for that drug, not to get high, but now just to feel normal. What happens? These patients whose brains have essentially been hijacked by the opioid engage in unethical, amoral, and manipulative behavior to get a certain type of prescription. I'm going to share with you some examples of strategies patients use to get a certain type of prescription, but I say that they do this because they're suffering from the disease of addiction. One common technique is the filibuster technique. These are patients who wait till the last 30 minutes of the appointment to ask for the refill because they know it takes about 30 seconds to say yes and about 30 minutes to say no. The sycophant, these are patients who flatter their doctor, you're so much better than my other doctor. The dynamic duo, these are patients and a significant other. In my experience, it's often the patient and their mother. The mother is crying, the patient is writhing on the ground. Very hard to say no, 2 against 1. The city mouse and the country mouse. So there are the very savvy patients who walk into the ED who say, I'm allergic to all painkillers except for IV Dilaudid push with a Benadryl chaser. And then there's the country mouse, the sort of sweet-faced innocent you would never guess, who says, doctor, my friend takes something oaksy, because I, as a physician, am a natural codependent. I say OxyContin. Yeah, doctor, that's it. And I write the prescription. The loser, these are patients who lose their prescriptions. Water is a common theme here. It went in the bottom of my fishing boat. It fell in the toilet. It went through the rinse cycle. The doctor shopper, these are patients who go out to multiple prescribers to get the same or a similar prescription. And then finally, the bully. This is a very effective strategy. At Stanford, this takes the form of, I'm going to call patient relations. Nobody at Stanford wants to get a call from patient relations. So you've got the compassionate doctor who wants to maintain that mutually affectionate relationship. You have the drug-seeking patient whose brain has been hijacked by the disease of addiction. And those two individuals do not work in a vacuum. They meet together in the larger context of the healthcare system in which there are perverse incentives driving overprescribing. I'm going to tell you what those are. There are 4 of them that I'm going to describe here. One is the way that big pharma has co-opted big medicine. I'm sure you've all read about how Purdue Pharma has done this. And I'm not just talking about direct-to-consumer advertising or even direct-to-doctor advertising with the hats, the pens, and the dinners. I'm talking about the way the pharmaceutical industry has infiltrated the very watchdog groups within medicine that were meant to keep medicine science-based. I'm talking about pharma infiltrating the FDA, the Federation of State Medical Boards, the Joint Commission, professional societies. And by doing that, they've been able to propagate 4 myths about opioids. So this is what I was taught in medical school in the 1990s about opioids, which we now know none of these things is true. Number 1, that opioids work for chronic pain. Opioids are fantastic treatment short-term for acute pain. They do not work for chronic pain. In fact, if you take them daily for weeks to months to years, they can even make pain worse through a process called opioid-induced hyperalgesia. Number 2, no dose is too high. So if a patient comes in and says, that really worked and it stopped working, I was taught to just keep going up and up and up and up, which is how we ended up with patients on 400 morphine milligram equivalents daily. Number 3, less than 1% get addicted if prescribed by a doctor for a bona fide medical condition, as if the prescription confers some sort of magic halo effect. We now know that up to a quarter of patients taking an opioid daily for a bona fide medical condition can develop prescription opioid misuse and get addicted. And then finally, this fake concept of pseudo-addiction. Patient seems addicted, they're not, they're just in pain, go up on the dose. The other invisible force is the Toyotaization of medicine. This is the way that we have developed an assembly line approach to care. Patients have left private and physician-owned practice. We are now employees of a large hospital systems. And because of that, there is a certain kind of herd mentality, and there's enormous pressure to practice along what I call the P paradigm, to palliate pain, to prescribe pills and perform procedures because that's what insurance companies will reimburse, to protect privacy, and to please patients. In essence, in this day and age, doctors have become waiters, patients have become our customers. A couple of years ago, my then 11-year-old son found this review of me on the internet. This is one of these doctor rating sites. And you'll look at the bottom, you'll see that Corey in 2013 gave me 1 out of 4 stars. And this is what he had to say about me. She provides the kind of care that will make you wish you had never sought help in the first place. Wrong diagnosis, wrong medication. In some cases, this can be terrible. Seek help from someone else. Mom, is that you? I thought about lying, saying that was the other Dr. Lembke who works at Stanford. But I admitted that it was me, and I was really mortified, and I wondered who else might have seen this review. I have been all over the country this year urging doctors to prescribe opioids more judiciously. And without fail, they come to me and say, Dr. Lembke, we'll prescribe fewer opioids when you promise us that our patients will still give us good scores on patient rating satisfaction surveys. This is a huge deal. It impacts professional advancement, impacts reimbursement, when in fact there's no evidence to show that higher patient satisfaction correlates with good health outcomes. This study at least shows that patients who like their doctors better are more likely to have greater inpatient use, more likely to take prescription drugs, and more likely to die. Now, the good news for me is that a couple minutes later, my son came out and he said, don't worry, Mom, I just gave you 4 out of 4 stars. Twice. Okay, the third invisible force is the medicalization of poverty. In the last 30 years, my career as a physician, doctors have been asked more and more to treat not just patients' biomedical problems, but also their socioeconomic problems, multi-generational trauma, unemployment, joblessness. But we haven't been given the tools to treat the problems that patients really have, so we are forced to biomedicalize problems that are not in fact biological and then prescribe a pill. And this is borne out a little bit in the data. These are Medicaid data showing that patients who are on Medicaid compared to patients who are not on Medicaid are prescribed painkillers at twice the rate of non-Medicaid patients and die from overdose rate at 6 times the rate. In other words, we treat the poor differently because we are biomedicalizing their non-medical problems. I have also seen a trend in which patients adopt the sick role now to make ends meet. Patients adopt the sick role and become what I call professional patients, partially unconsciously, partially consciously, as a way to pay the bills. Actually, Mark Duggan's work in this was really pivotal for me. He has shown that SSDI in 1957, there were 150,000 people on SSDI receiving disability, and the number one reasons were cancer and cardiac disease. By 2016, there were 8 million people receiving disability. Number one reasons, mental illness and musculoskeletal disorders. I can tell you, I have seen more and more patients in my medical practice who are not there to get well. They're there to be validated in their sick role, and part of getting validation in their sick role can include taking certain types of pills. In other words, because we have made medicine our social safety net, we have influenced and encouraged people to participate in the healthcare system in a way that ultimately causes them more harm than good. And then finally, very briefly, I think cultural narratives have played a role here. We now have a very different narrative around pain. We believe in medicine that pain is dangerous, that if our patients experience any kind of pain, it can leave them with a kind of psychic scar that sets them up for future pain, either in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder or in the form of some kind of centralizing pain syndrome. So there's enormous pressure on doctors to eradicate all pain immediately. By the way, it wasn't always this way 150 years ago. Doctors believed that pain was salutary, that it could boost the immune response. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We don't think of pain that way anymore. If there is a patient in our hospital in pain, that doctor is not doing their job. We also believe that doctors have superhuman abilities to heal, particularly when aided by technology. Patients have very, very high expectations. So the question is, how can we do better? Instead of fluctuating between enabling this problem or retaliating against these patients and kicking them out of their practice, which is also what is happening. There's a cohort of what we call opioid refugees who used to get their pain pills from docs and are now wandering around from clinic to clinic, can't find anybody to take care of them, turning to heroin, etc. Number one, we need to mandate prevention. Doctors will not be able to police themselves. As Gina Raimundo said, her prescribing legislation is not popular among doctors, and it won't be, but I can tell you with all of the perverse incentives inside of medicine, incentivizing overprescribing, we should legislate that doctors can only prescribe certain amounts for a certain number of days. We need to think of addiction as a chronic relapsing and remitting disease, and I urge you to do that even if you don't really believe it is one. I think that reasonable people could have a fascinating debate about whether or not addiction is a disease. It doesn't matter. In this day and age, biologizing problems is how we solve them. If we don't biologize addiction, we will continue to perpetuate the problem. We need to change the perverse incentives inside of medicine that are driving overprescribing. Let's get rid of patient satisfaction surveys. They don't correlate with good health outcomes. They incentivize doctors in the wrong direction. Let's pay doctors to actually spend time with patients, to educate them, to build a relationship. We need to enforce more separation between medicine and big pharma. This is a given, but very hard to make happen. And finally, we need to provide alternative sources of dopamine. Maya Dorado, she got dopamine for years from Olympic swimming. That's awesome. We need to give every kid access to a pool or some equivalent. I have a patient in recovery who was able to get into recovery because he was able to go to welding school. He never made it in the traditional school system, but there was the opportunity for welding, and now he's a welder and doing great. And let me tell you, that has been key to his recovery in addition to the buprenorphine that I prescribed for him. Thanks for listening.
It's going to be an interesting afternoon. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Ann Case. She's the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton. Ann has had a very distinguished career, as many of you know, at Princeton, tackling over a period of several decades many of the outstanding relationships between health and other critical demographic features. She has been rewarded for this work on many occasions. She's a previous recipient of the Ken Arrow Prize in Health Economics. She was elected to the National Academy of Medicine. She serves on council at the National Institute for Child Health. And perhaps most importantly, she's recently been multiply prized for her 2015 piece on rising mortality in the middle-aged white population. It appeared in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and she received the extremely prestigious Cozzarelli Award at the end of the year for the best paper in social science of the year. It's a great pleasure to have Ann here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to share this work. I want to set the stage here just by telling you a little bit about what's been happening to white mortality in the US, because I think it comes as something of a surprise. What you're looking at here are the trends in mortality rate by 5-year age group, so people 30 to 34, 35 to 39, up to people in their 60s. And the blue is the trend for white non-Hispanics. Red is for black non-Hispanics, orange is for Hispanics, and then this green is for comparison countries that sort of kind of look like the US, other English-speaking countries, and France and Sweden and Germany. And what you see is that while progress is being made in the black community, in the Hispanic community, in all these comparison countries, something funny has gone on for the white community. Now, for people in their 30s, no one really dies in their 30s, so you can make the trend bounce up and down a little bit. So the fact that mortality rates have been growing by 1.5% per year for those people is not such a surprise. But the fact that we've stopped making progress at all in any of these age groups for whites is really something that's quite stunning. And I want to use that because I think that what I really want to do is to put the opioids into kind of a larger perspective here of an increase in what we've come to call deaths of despair. So in every state in the US, for people in what I can call broadly middle-aged, 25 to 64, in every state, suicide rates rose. Between 1999 and 2015. Alcoholic liver disease rose in every state, but Maryland, where the rates were flat. And drug overdoses increased in every state. So this is something that's happening nationwide. Now with the drugs, trying to describe it is like trying to shoot at a moving target. So the prescription opioids that Anna has been working on and talked about so well, were a really big problem starting from the time OxyContin was introduced in 1996. But now the OxyContin is being replaced by heroin. And in fact, OxyContin is basically heroin in a pill with an FDA label on it. So it's not so surprising that when we started to turn the taps off of prescription opioids, people turned to the substitute that was just about perfect, and it was a lot cheaper and readily available. And from there, then, people have moved to fentanyl, which is even more dangerous and has been responsible for a lot of deaths. I spent the beginning of this week in Washington working with the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the substance abuse and mental health people. And collectively, we are thinking of all three of these, alcohol, drugs, suicide, as all being suicide. It's either slowly with drugs and alcohol, or it's quickly with a gun. But there is something going on here to which then having something as powerful and as readily available as OxyContin was like just throwing fuel on flames. So I want to tell you a few facts, and then I want to tell you where my research is currently going, because we were trying to figure out what the heck is going on here and why is this happening? And why is this such a surprise? I mean, it turns out that usually if something bad is happening, we think it generally happens to a community that has less education on average, that might be poorer on average. And this is not happening as much in the Black community or the Hispanic community. This is happening to whites who are on average better educated and have higher income. So a few facts. One being that the mortality rates for all three of these, suicide, alcohol, and drugs, have been increasing for both men and women. So here's a picture that I wanted to show. The death rates are generally thought of as deaths per 100,000, and that's what you're looking at here. Going back to the mid-1990s through to 2015, These are deaths of despair, that's drugs, alcohol, and suicide, for men with a high school degree or less, that's the top blue line, women with a high school degree or less in red. And you can see they're rising in parallel. Men are still more likely to kill themselves using any three of these techniques, but the increase is the same for both men and women. And yes, it's also happening to men and women with a bachelor's degree or more. That is actually rising. You can't see it very well on the graph because it's dwarfed by what's happening to people with less education. But I think when you look at this slide, or when I look at this slide as a Rorschach test, what I see is the big divide here is by education. It's not really by men and women. That's where and a question I want to ask here. Do you see the Great Recession in this picture? Because I don't. Right? This is a slow, steady increase. It's like the drum beat's just getting louder. And in fact, if we took this back further, we can look at education on death records going back only to about 1992. Before that, not all the states had it on their records. But going back that far, what you see is this slow, steady rise in deaths from all these causes. Fact number 2, it's happening in urban and in rural areas. So if you look at these deaths of despair by level of urbanization, the blue line on top are the large inner cities, and the light blue line at the bottom are large fringe metro areas. That's like where we sit now, or where I live in Princeton, New Jersey. There's a red line in the middle there, which is rural areas. The press would make this into a crisis really about what's happening in rural America. And it's happening there, for sure. But when someone from the press calls me up and says, I want to tell me where to go in West Virginia, I want to go to a rural area. And I say, well, why don't you go to Baltimore City? You know, why don't you actually go there? It's happening basically in all parts of the country. These increases, underneath this sort of increase in death rate, is just a sea of despair in reports of pain, in reports of mental health, in reports self-assessed physical health. And year on year, going back in the National Health Interview Survey, which is a nationally representative survey that you can then stack year on year on year and see what's going on, what we see are increases in what we call morbidity, just a deterioration in health, deterioration in mental health. And I want to give you just one example, but I could give you plenty, but I'll just give you this one. Social scientists love the question on physical health because it's cheap to ask in surveys and people can answer it really readily. And it turns out that it's predictive of changes in mortality, even 10 years out. How would you say your health is at present? Excellent, very good, good, fair, poor. So if you look at what people say by age, this is a fraction of people who report excellent or very good health. In one of the big nationally representative surveys, this is from 1993 to 95, and I like to say to my students, you can kind of see where you are and you can kind of see where this is going, right? Which is like, it's not going to be pretty, right? So, but that was 93 to 95. If you fast forward, how did people answer that question a few years later at the end of the 90s? A smaller fraction of people in midlife reported excellent or very good health, while the elderly, thank you very much, are doing a little bit better. Fast forward again, that's 2004 to 7, and it continues. There's 2010 to 12, and it continues. There's 2013 to 15. So people are reporting themselves in poorer health. They also score much poorer on mental health scores. They're more likely to report physical pain, especially sciatica, which if you've never suffered from it is lower back pain that shoots down your leg, but also migraines and face pain and neck pain. So pain is something also in the national institutes that is really, it's seen as a trigger. It's a trigger for suicide. It's also something that people tend to try to want to self-medicate with drugs or with alcohol. I'm going to show you a sort of nerdy slide, but I think it's really important for the way that we are currently thinking about this problem. that if you look birth cohort to birth cohort, what you see is that the crisis is worse with every successive birth cohort. So on the left here, these are mortality rates from drugs and alcohol and suicide by birth cohort and by age across the bottom, but the mortality rate is up the y-axis. So in magenta, that's the bottom, the very oldest birth cohort here of 1935. You can see what the rates look like for deaths of despair. And then you see, by the time you get to the birth cohort of 1950, which is in red, you can see that it's much higher. And for the cohort of 55, it's say age 50, it's higher still. And the cohort born in 1960, it's higher still. So what you see is that at any given age, the risk of dying of one of these deaths of despair is higher for later born birth cohorts. But note what you see. On the left, those are people without a bachelor's degree. On the right, people with a bachelor's degree or more. So it's like you're looking at two Americas here, right? One that went to college and one that didn't. So for us, this is sort of encapsulating of a lot of the data that we can bring to the table, right? These are body counts, but we say the same thing for people without a BA when it comes to mental health, when it comes to reports of pain, when it comes to difficulty socializing with others, things that we think put them at risk of suicide or slow suicide through drugs or alcohol. In addition to these changes in their health, though, there have been really profound changes in social and economic conditions that these people are living under. There's just a lack of stability now in life for people who didn't go to college. They're a lot less likely to get married. They're more likely to cohabit, which is, there's no sort of moral sanction against that now the way there might have been a generation ago. But these cohabitation they're not stable the way they are in Europe. And in the US, they're quite unstable. Our friends in sociology have been telling us about this for a decade, that if the guy doesn't have a good job, she doesn't want to marry him. She wants to leave her options open. And he might want to be leaving his options open too. They may have a child together. But then they break up. He may not see the children in the future. There's a lot, so it's a very fragile home life. There's also a lot more fragility when it comes to the labor market. The fraction of men at age 35 who are not in the labor force has tripled among men without a BA. And also, median wages for people without a BA are lower and lower with successive birth cohorts, right? So median being at the 50% mark, which gives us a pretty good read on what's going on. For each later born birth cohort, wages start lower and they peak at a lower level and at an earlier age. So there's just been a real deterioration in people's jobs prospects, in their home lives. There's also been a real shift in religion, so that people have not changed the extent to which they say that they're religious in the US, but they've given up on the kind of mainline Protestant and Catholic churches, and they've gone more toward churches that Bob Withnow, who's a sociologist at Princeton, calls seeking churches, which is about your own individual experience. And it doesn't necessarily provide you with the same kind of stability that you might have gotten from a legacy church. So there's less labor force attachment, more mental distress, more difficulty socializing, more pain, more drugs, more alcohol, more suicide. We see this as kind of a slow collapse of the white working class. It was unfolding, it started unfolding way before heavy-duty prescription opioids flooded the market. But certainly the presence of them makes everything worse. European countries haven't suffered in the same way. And we're hard at work trying to actually pin down, quantify why that's the case. Maybe it's the better social safety nets. Maybe it's better social connection. Maybe it's more stability in their cohabiting relationships. They certainly have not gone into the business of handing out jelly bean jars full of opioids the way that we have in the US. Wage growth has been stagnant there since the Great Recession in some countries, but it's not 50 years of stagnation, which it is among men in the US labor market. Black non-Hispanics have also not suffered the same way whites have suffered. And although there are some red flags post-2010, and we think that's fentanyl coming onto the market because mortality rates for blacks in each of these 5-year age groups have suddenly begun to click up just a little bit, and we think that's fentanyl. We're work at this as well. Perhaps it's stronger family networks. Perhaps it's a closer attachment to legacy churches. Perhaps that they're used to being treated really poorly by a labor market, and whites without a BA were not as accustomed to being treated that way. It used to be with a high school degree, you could get a good job, a job with on-the-job training, a job with a ladder up, a job with benefits. Those jobs are gone. Those jobs are not coming back. And the 10 million jobs that have been created net since the end of the Great Recession, all of them have been for people with college degrees. And they're all in the gig economy, but they're not for this group. So where do we go from here? We tend to think that the cancer is in the labor market, and that we don't think it's send everyone to college. That's certainly not the answer, and it would be treating a problem that's really about a labor market problem with something like education, which isn't really a good fit for it. The loss of unions, private sector unions, are now down to about 7% of the labor market. I don't care if you thought unions were good or unions were bad, unions are gone, right? They're not coming back. But they were a voice for labor at the table. 1 in 5 people working with a high school degree or less has had to sign a non-compete clause, which means if I'm in a McDonald's and the McDonald's down the street offers me higher wages, I can't take that job. Now, people know that the way your wages go up is by changing jobs. And if you've signed a non-compete clause as a blue-collar worker, that's just not available to you. I think maybe most people don't understand that if you have employer-provided health insurance, that health insurance is invisibly coming out of your wages. So that you might not value it at what the employer has to pay for it, but you're paying for it through lower wages. There's been this acceleration in businesses contracting out lower skilled jobs. So that makes it the case that people who start at the bottom will never be able to work their way up in a firm. You know, the stories that we know, and some of them actually are true, of people who started out in clerical and ended up being CEOs. Those jobs are actually gone because I have to work for the Everbright cleaning company. Well, the Everbright cleaning company, who is then contracting with big employers, also acts as a monopsonist, right? So they have a lot more control over keeping wages down than would be the case otherwise. Globalization and technical change. As an economist, I think all of that globalization and technical change brings real merit, but it's a policy choice how we decide to distribute the gains that are made from that. So in European countries, there's a value-added tax, which is an invisible tax, which actually is used to pay for the social safety nets. In the US, we've been extremely reluctant to go there. But I think if we don't do something to try to re-knit the fabric between labor and capital in the US, we are all at risk. So I'm going to leave it at that, a very happy note. I wish I was here to tell you about the Olympics, but I'm not, so thank you.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. I was actually going to squander a few of our precious minutes by attempting to pull together some stylized facts of the two quite interesting but quite different narratives that we've now heard to try and explain the critical situation that we're currently in. I thought rather I would kick off by asking each of our guests a question or two, but mostly leave the remaining time to those of you who are sitting in the audience on this beautiful day to try and see whether we can make a little bit of progress. So I want to start perhaps, Anna, with you and just try and get some sense because we didn't really get a good overview of this. Of the various kinds of interventions that are out there now, what's potentially working? And I ask the question with particular concern to the CDC data released just in the last couple of days, suggesting that at least at the mortality level, even though we have seen a cutback in prescription narcotics over the past couple of years, the mortality rates continue to rise in the most affected parts of the population. So is there a state, is there a champion, is there a policy that we can say, at least in terms of really tiding this piece of the overall epidemic of despair, we're making some progress?
Well, when you think about stemming the tide of any public health crisis, you want to limit the number of new cases, so there's prevention, and you want to treat the cases that are there. In terms of limiting the number of new cases, we have to get doctors to prescribe less. We have not been very good at that. So again, since peak prescribing in 2012, prescribing has gone down, and that's good, but in general, we're still prescribing way too much. In terms of treating new cases, Gina Raimundo gave a beautiful example of if you offer access to all the different types of treatment for opioid addiction that are available, because just like with cancer, pneumonia, some treatments are going to work for some people and other treatments are going to work for others. So you have to have the full menu of options. And when that's available and there's an infrastructure built in that makes that available, like per her report in the prison system in Rhode Island, then you get traction. What we need to do is build an infrastructure to treat addiction within the house of medicine. We do not have that. What we have now is siloed care, mental health over here, addiction over there. If you're rich, you go to Betty Ford. If you're poor, you go to AA. And then we have the house of medicine. So I think where we're making incremental, albeit siloed progress, is where we have healthcare institutions who are cooperating with communities to build a reasonable infrastructure to get people to treatment and deliver that treatment in a cost-effective way paid for by their insurance company.
Okay. Any iconic examples, just so,
I think Kaiser has struggled with this just like any other healthcare institution, but Kaiser has done a really good job creating, not at all Kaisers, but at some Kaisers, some model clinics where their very high opioid utilizers are helped through a careful and supportive process to get down to a lower dose, and then are either triaged to a chronic pain treatment environment that doesn't involve the use of opioids, but instead utilizes the most evidence-based treatment for chronic pain, which is physical therapy, psychotherapy, trigger point injections, massage. Or has set up a chemical dependency and rehabilitation program, which Kaiser has. One-stop shopping. You can walk in intoxicated, you can walk in withdrawal, you can walk in wanting any kind of help at any stage in your addiction disease, and they will be able to provide it for you. We do not have that in most healthcare settings.
Great. Thank you. And turning to you, you walked us pretty close to an attempt at a synthesis of some of the data that might link the opioid part of this crisis to the broader deaths of despair, diseases of despair, which I think is, at least from a public health point of view, the way many of us are now speaking of it. And you also, I was extremely pleased to see, talked about some of the deep causes of social causes that are occurring primarily in the less educated white population that might be at the heart of some of these problems. But I wonder if you more explicitly could talk about how the opioid version of this narrative, in which we really are focusing on the behavior of doctors, the supply of drugs, the continued prescription of those drugs, the failure of treatment, integrates well into the broader narrative of 50 years of wage stagnation, failure of growth, death of unions, loss of good manufacturing jobs. I mean, two quite different kinds of narratives.
You see, I don't see them as different narratives. What I see is that people need to soothe the beast. And some people are going to soothe it with alcohol, some people are going to soothe it with drugs, some people soothe it with food. I think way out in the future we may understand the obesity epidemic as being part and parcel of this, that people use food in the same way. And so I actually think that people, when life has not worked out in the way that they thought it was going to. Now, this could be either expectations about the future, that you should live a life at least as good as the life that your parents lived, or that your children should be able to live a better life than the one you live, right? Which is also part of the American dream. And if you might feel you're stymied, but if you think things might be better for your children and you have hope, then you're less likely to turn to a pill that someone offers you. I also, through the folks I was talking to in Washington earlier in the week, there's a really strong connection, mind-to-body connection. So I think that sometimes the physical pain people feel comes from the fact that psychologically they're in quite a lot of despair. But that doesn't make the physical pain any less real. It just tells you perhaps where it came from. But I think that if we cannot offer people a brighter future, they will turn to things to numb themselves, to check out, to take themselves out of the system.
So at least in this framing of it, you would, if I understand correctly, say that as you put it actually in your talk, that the supply, the increasing supply of opioids in the marketplace became fuel for a fire that was raging. But unless I misunderstand, absent other more fundamental steps to address the underlying causes of that fire, that the efforts to try and limit the supply of opioids will only have a small dent in the larger picture? I mean, would you go that far?
Right. I would go that far. I would be interested to see what Anna thinks about this, but given just how substitutable heroin is for prescription opioids, and the fact that this very pure, very cheap black tar heroin coming in from Mexico by guys wearing suits who are willing to deliver to Indiana or rural Maine, that turning off the taps will be helpful, but first of all, the genie's out of the bottle for a lot of people who got there through prescription drugs, but that it may be a little too late.
Right. Well, you've asked my next question, which is, what are we going to do about the interdiction of illicit supplies of drugs, which indeed we are watching now, and I think I would not be, although I hardly have your expertise in addiction medicine, in previous epidemics of drug abuse that we've lived through, most of us of one kind or another, the interdiction of supplies has been particularly difficult as an overall strategy, and I wonder whether even as we finally teach doctors how to behave and perhaps begin to lower the at-risk population, we'll only be opening up the floodgates towards more illicit behavior and creating black markets, if you will, or fueling those black markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think the question is it a supply problem or is it a demand problem, which I think is what you were trying to ask. And you clearly come down on the side of it's a demand problem. If people had more rewarding lives, if they had an alternative source of dopamine, meaningful work, stable relationships, then they wouldn't need to turn to opioids. And that's that relates to one of the most classic experiments in the field of addiction called the rat park experiment. If to get a rat addicted to cocaine, you put it in a little cage and you give it a lever, and pretty much every rat will press the lever till they die. But the rat park experiment, which was Bruce Alexander's experiment, said, well, what if you put a rat with a lever for cocaine with a little wheel and some nice soft little, cotton and some other rats? What you find when you do that is they're not as likely to press the lever, and they're not as likely to get addicted. What I would argue, which is a roundabout way to get answering your question, okay, is that we are living in Rat Park with levers at every turn of the maze. So we are so flooded with highly dopaminergic stimuli, and we don't even need to just look at opioids. You can look at the food that we eat. You can look at the screens and technology that we use, sex, shopping, gambling, you name it. We are living in a dopamine-saturated environment. And no amount of, stemming it off at the borders, who cares? We'll buy it from an online pharmacy that's impossible to shut down. Yep. It'll get delivered to our doorstep by FedEx or in the Amazon locker so my parents don't know that I got it. Speaking of teenagers, who I talked to this morning at Palo Alto High School. So my point is, can we legislate less dopamine in our environment? I think we need to try. But I think ultimately what's going to be required is a huge cultural shift where people recognize that in many ways we're all vulnerable to addiction in this day and age, and that we need to practice kind of cultural and values that have sort of gone out the window. Things like self-discipline, restraint, asceticism, denial, things that are really quite out of vogue in this. I was fascinated by the seeking church. Like, to me, that's fascinating. It's like church used to be, or let's say religious involvement used to be a way of taking care of the community. Now church or religious involvement can be a way of just like sort of discovering yourself. There's so much navel gazing. This is a little bit far afield, but that's basically my view.
Well, I'm going to go one step further afield for Anne before I turn it over to our very patient audience, which is it's a speculation that I've been dying to try on someone, and we're going to try it here. So what does all of this have to do with what I'll affectionately call the politics of despair that we discussed in the previous session? And I think most of us know, if you look at the population that's been so dreadfully impacted by all three of these conditions, even to the extent that there is some geographic distribution with some accentuation rurally, it certainly looks to me like a political map.
I think listening to Secretary Rice this morning, right, and I think that she was appealing to all of us that we really did need to worry about investments in human capital or human development. I think those were the words she used. And that she worried a bit for our politics if we did not. And I can tell you that if you break the U.S. down into 1,000 small units, bigger than counties, but smaller than states, and you correlate mortality in midlife among whites with the fraction voting for Trump, the correlation is about 0.5, which in a cross-section is huge. But that you can correlate a lot of things that way. But, yeah. But I think that her message of "Can you hear me now?" right? The "Can you hear me now?" election. There are people who feel like they have not been being heard, and we see now as the bodies pile up, these people have reason to be in great despair, and I believe it's incumbent upon us to try to figure out what we can do to try to right that ship.
I could not agree more. Anyway, with that, I'm going to throw it open to the audience. There are, as always, microphones going around just because we're recording the event, and it's best if you can ask your question into a microphone.
So Anna? Sure. You have the same names. So I wanted to ask about what you think about the role of Narcan in fighting the epidemic, and in particular, there was a working paper that got a lot of attention on the internet the other day, suggesting that Narcan could make things worse or not make things better because people just continue to overdose and overdose and overdose, and even though you save a life, ultimately that life is not saved without other kinds of treatment. And so I was just sort of curious from your perspective how you were thinking about the role of this in the epidemic.
Right. So for those of you who don't know, Narcan is an opioid receptor antagonist. It binds to the opioid receptor, kicking out any opioid that's on the receptor. and thereby resuscitating somebody who is overdosed and is about to die from taking too many opioids. It's been one of the mainstays of intervention in the opioid epidemic, making Narcan more broadly available, making sure that first responders like paramedics have Narcan available, that there are good Samaritan laws to protect people who use Narcan, to prescribe Narcan to patients to whom you also prescribe opioids, to give it to their family members, to make it available without a prescription at pharmacies. So it's been one of the mainstays. Now, I'm going to engage in heresy here when I say that the data, and everybody cares about numbers, and that's great, so do I. The data are pretty convincing that Narcan saves lives, but many people who overdose and are revived will need to be revived again within months of that having happened, and many of them go on to die. It's also true anecdotally that there are now Narcan parties where young people go and there's a designated Narcan person in order to use the Narcan to revive people who are using opioids recreationally at a party. It's also true, I know from colleagues who work at the Valley, people who intentionally go to the Valley Hospital into the bathroom and use there because they know that if they overdose, a medical professional will find them and be able to use Narcan to revive them. So, these are the unintended consequences. This is the dark side. Let me just say, in terms of interventions overall for the epidemic, it's so downstream, like we have to move way back here, But obviously there's utility there, but there's also unintended consequences.
Great. Thank you. Next question from the audience.
Why are they overdosing instead of dosing? Would it make sense to have better labeling, better testing? If people are going to use this, like let's say alcohol, you use alcohol to get high, but you don't want to pass out.
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you. So overdose is really a misnomer. The gap between the desired dose or effect and the overdose with opioids is so small. That's why they're so incredibly lethal. It's a very narrow window. If you get addicted, you build up tolerance over time, meaning you need more and more to get the same effect. And so there's the chasing the high. It's always a little bit more. Very sadly, when people hear about heroin being laced with illicit fentanyl and people dying from it, they actually want to go to that dealer and get that because you always need more. That's why opioid addiction has been called historically chasing the dragon. It's like that mythical creature that you'll never find. The other thing is, as I said, tried to say in my talk, but I probably didn't explain it well, is that a lot of people who die from opioids aren't increasing their dose. Mostly that's polypharmacy. So if you have a high dose of opioids for chronic pain, even prescribed by your doctor medicinally, and you combine it with a benzo from your psychiatrist because you've been having anxiety, mixing those even once, you could fall asleep and not wake up again. Or you go to a party and drink a little bit, or you get pneumonia, or you have obstructive sleep apnea. So that's why. Yeah.
Thank you. Did I see one over here?
I think Mark has a question.
Where? Mark. Mark. Yes. Wait a second, Mark. Rosanna will take care of you.
So I'm curious of the role of, if you think any, that pharmaceutical manufacturers could potentially play in this. They're consuming a product, and they can look ahead and see that maybe there are more regulations coming down the pike. And are there things that the companies are doing, or that obviously higher quantity is more revenue, but it's complicated. So I'm just curious if you know of anything that's happening.
Right. Well, the manufacturers, opioid manufacturers and distributors, are now being sued in a multi-district litigation presided by Judge Dan Polster. So they are going to be called to the carpet for their role in the epidemic, and as part of trying to do good, I think, and as also part of trying to look good in anticipation of this legal hearing. Purdue Pharma, for example, recently said it would no longer send out drug reps directly to doctors. So that's a big about face on the part of Purdue. They've changed the FDA has changed the labeling. So now it says these are addictive. You can have overdoses, and probably just like the tobacco litigation, this litigation, if the people who are suing the opioid manufacturers win, there will be billions of dollars that will have to be paid. and then how that should be paid in order to redress the wrongs will be very, very interesting. There's also in states like Minnesota a 1 cent per 1 milligram opioid tax legislation where opioid manufacturers will have to pay 1 penny into a blind trust for every milligram of opioid they sell in that state, and that money will then be used to treat addiction.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah.
Just the Purdue Pharmaceutical is doing just what the cigarette manufacturers did, which is it's decided that this market is probably closing down and it's moving into the middle income markets. So it now has an international arm that is setting up shop in Brazil and Mexico and the Philippines, that no one should be in pain and we should all get over our opioid phobia. And so that it's like the cigarette manufacturers did. It knows it can make money elsewhere. So
It's brutal. Over here.
As states are writing legislation regarding modifying prescribing behaviors, we risk making access to opioids by the end-of-life clients in hospice and palliative care. Can you address that issue?
Yes, so thank you. That's an excellent point. And, we don't want to go to the other extreme where we now don't have access to opioids for people who need it. But I can tell you that we're so far on the extreme of overprescribing that in my opinion, there's no danger in the imminent future of overcorrecting. And specifically when you talk about hospice and palliative care, end of life, what we see often now is patients who have been on so many opioids for so long for a terminal condition that when they really get to the end of life, they die in excruciating pain because they're so opioid tolerant and there's nothing more you can give them to relieve the pain. So that's the great tragedy on the palliative care side of having prescribed too many opioids too soon for too many people. There's some people back here.
There's one over here.
Over here.
You touched on the role of obesity in only a very circumspect sort of way, but there is another relationship which is inversely related to education and wealth, which is the incredible obesity pandemic. And the question I have is, does this correlate with pain and suffering, given the tendency for overweight people to suffer not only from diabetes, but from all sorts of other problems that are as a result of the carbohydrate crisis? And for that matter, as you're talking about the social impact of the underprivileged here, are we also talking about not taking care of the obesity problem and that being causal?
Anne, you want to take a swing?
sure, the obesity epidemic is certainly front and center with the fact that we stopped making progress on heart disease in this group. And for a very long time, the progress we made against heart disease was enough to offset the fact that these deaths of despair were rising. So that was all flying under the radar until heart disease progress flatlined. And a lot of that is probably the obesity epidemic right there. But we know from data that at any level of body mass index, certainly pain goes up with body mass index. You're carrying more weight on your bones, you just have more problems with your back, with your hips. But what we've seen is a shift up of that entire curve, so that at any given body mass index, later years in the survey, people are more likely to report pain. So as sort of like movement along the curve, you can definitely say that we should have expected more pain with more obesity, but there's been a whole shift up of the relationship between obesity and pain.
Including the increasing risk of pain or the increasing prevalence of pain with succeeding generations controlling for age, which would be hard to explain based on obesity alone. The other comment that I'm curious on your thoughts, and since you have dabbled extensively in demography, is the somewhat different subsets of the population that have been at least differentially affected by some of these things. So unfortunately, the non-white and Hispanic populations have hardly been spared even slightly from the obesity epidemic, and at least up till now have been relatively spared deep involvement in this part of the so-called epidemic of despair. And I just wonder if that demographic difference resonates in any way, or is anything you infer from that?
Yeah, for a very long time I thought, how could the slowdown in our progress on heart disease have anything to do with obesity, given that blacks are more obese than whites, and the trend up has been the same, but heart disease mortality continues to fall for blacks but not for whites. But of course, it's always more complicated. So if you break it up into the fact that the heart disease mortality changes have something to do with tobacco and something to do with drugs and alcohol and something to do with obesity, that it looks as if obesity certainly does have a role to play. It's just that either by better control of hypertension, blacks continue to make progress year on year against heart disease in a way that uncontrolled hypertension for whites with less than a BA has actually started to go the wrong way for the last 10 years, putting them at risk. So
I think it's also worth speculating that maybe one of the reasons that black and brown people have been spared to some extent by the opioid epidemic is because they are historically more suspicious of doctors, less likely to be insured, less likely to participate in health care, at least initially.
So are you arguing this has protected them? I mean, it's
Yes.
certainly an interesting speculation.
Yeah.
well, it's also alcohol, though, too, right, Anna? I mean, so alcohol mortality for blacks has been falling, while for whites it's been rising. So that's not really doctor-related, but it's been happening.
We'll have time for one last question, and we have an eager questioner.
All day, these have been wonderful presentations. I'm trying to put all the different dots and connect them. And starting with human capital and this crisis, that we will not be a great nation in the future if we don't take care of this issue. And going through all of these presentations, with the exception of the Olympics and high tech, which is a separate audience for a lot of these issues, I'm hearing many, many things that say that if you don't finish high school, or you finish high school, you don't go to university, and you are poor, and 20% of our country's children are growing up in poverty, and then your parents or your neighborhood are suffering from any of these issues that we've listed, including many more we can think of, crime and so forth, the interventions seem trivial to me. They must be major public policy interventions that require a serious democratic change in our country.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Did you have an additional, is there any additional question here? Maybe we've got 2 more minutes, so one more over here.
Thank you. I was curious, because you view addiction as a medical problem, what you think about non-medical treatments, approaches to rehabilitation. For example, the role of religious organizations in promoting rehabilitation that advocates for cold turkey approaches and doesn't use a kind of like medical approach in order to treat victims of addiction.
Yeah, so I advocate for conceptualizing addiction as a medical problem, not because I think it's exactly like cancer, but because I think that biologizing problems in this day and age is how we solve them, and we're not going to get traction unless we make it a medical problem and treat it like a medical problem. Having said that, addiction is a complex biopsychosocial problem. So it's nature, nurture, and neighborhood, which means that non-medical interventions have historically and continue to have a very important role in targeting this problem. One of the most amazing social movements in the last 100 years is Alcoholics Anonymous. We know that for people who participate in 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous, who actively engage, who go to meetings, who get a sponsor, they do fantastic. I'm always thrilled when I have a patient who's already in AA or NA or decides to join those organizations, because it makes my job a whole heck of a lot easier. And why do those people get well? Because they change their lives, because they have a social support group that becomes embedded in the natural fabric of their day-to-day experience. I can't do that for people. I'm at most once a week for half an hour. Religious organizations are vital in this and have historically played the primary role in helping people with addiction. Prior to 1900s, that was who took care of people with addiction, was religious organizations. As we've secularized, medicine is now where that takes place. But it doesn't mean that religious organizations no longer play a role. And I do think ultimately, although I absolutely agree with this gentleman that we need major public policy interventions, I do believe that some aspect of this very serious problem, which I think is the most important problem facing us in the next 100 years, cannot be legislated, that these are going to be problems that will have to be addressed through a philosophical discourse, through religious discourse, through culture.
In any event, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank our guests.
Thank you.
This has been